Hello, good evening, and many thanks for joining us on yet another episode of 360 Degrees on Rwanda Television. My name, as always, is Sam Kalisa. And on this particular edition, we can't go far from what's going on currently, which is the Africa Green Revolution Forum, the 12th annual summit that kicked off right here in Kigali and is taking place under the theme Grow, Nourish and Reward, Bold Actions for Resilient Food Systems. Over 2,000 delegates and participants are convening right here in Kigali for a few days to explore solutions to problems hindering the goal of attaining food sufficiency in Africa and beyond. And this particularly will be our topic and matter of discussion while we take a look at food security on the African continent and beyond, with bold actions that are needed for to achieve resilient food systems on the continent. Joining me this evening, starting on my immediate left, is Professor Jide Karuranga. He's a researcher and analyst. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us this evening on 360 Degrees is Adebe Haile Gabriel. He's the Assistant Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, representative for the African region. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's a pleasure.
All right. Talking about food security and food systems on the African continent, what one can ask, or what comes to everyone's mind first, is food security. How do we describe this, starting with you, Mr. Gabriel? How do you describe, or how do we define food security?
Thank you for that question, and it's always important to start from the basics. Food security is the ability of individuals or households. We can also aggregate it at the level of the country to have adequate food at all times, which is affordable, which is available, which is also sustainable and nutritious in terms of quality.
All right.
So this is what is meant by food security.
All right. Professor Jide, he just defined it right. It's everyone's ability to get what to eat. And when we talk about food security, Africa always comes with a question mark that we really do not have food security on the continent. Do you see it that way?
Well, it's not only in Africa. Food security and safety, which is also a concept attached to security, is a global problem.
All right.
And it has been there since I think the beginning of humanity, because people have been struggling to get enough food, safe food, and sustainable food. I mean sustainable base of sustainable sources of food.
All right, and
so
what's the matter?
Really, so now, today is probably a defining moment, because we have recently experienced 3 major shocks within a short period of time. So the first shock was the pandemic. So, and then there is the war in Ukraine. Then there is the disruption of supply chain. So that's the reason why it becomes now to the top agenda of any decision maker to look into our own behavior. So it's a global problem.
All right.
So now, how do we go about it is the critical question we face today, to avoid or to be more prepared for future shocks.
All right.
So can we cope with the shocks today? I mean, the 2 main shocks, or the 3, the disruption of supply chain following the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and make sure that the future is easier for us to design.
All right. I'll go to you, Adebe. He just talked about the 3 things that are determining factors when it comes to food security globally, but I'll try to narrow it to the African continent, which is our main focus even in this particular Africa Green Revolution Summit. One of the things that are being talked about, which could actually bring food sustainability on the continent, is innovation to transform food systems in Africa for sustainable food security. What sort of innovations, let's start there, what sort of innovations are needed to really address this huge and very big issue of food security on the continent?
Countries or or communities or individuals can access to food, either through production, they can produce it, or through purchasing it. So they should have income, sufficient income.
All right.
As my brother mentioned, these shocks, including the conflict and the climate-related shocks, the COVID-19 and so on, what they do is disrupt both production and the entire supply chain. So when we're talking about innovation and how innovation can help towards the achievement of food security, we are addressing the whole value chain. Right from the production until it is it arrives on the consumer's table. So innovation as applied to production, it means application of science, technology to increase productivity. Innovation on the supply chain to reduce cost, but also reduce post-harvest losses to enhance food safety. Innovation on the marketing side to improve market efficiency, but also innovation at the consumption side to also avoid food waste. So I'm just using this as examples of the continuum where innovation can impact food security. So it is at different levels, and innovation is key.
And it's at different levels, but where do we stand right now on the continent?
Africa is not really doing well in terms of innovation. If you look at production, on average, cereal productivity is about a third. It's about 1/3 of what the average of the developing world, I did not talk about the developed world, the developing world could achieve. So it's a very low level of productivity. It's because of low input, technology. We are at a very low level of development. And we can apply the same system across the whole supply value chains. So we're at a very low level, but we can look at it from different perspective. It means we have a gap, and we can fill that gap. It's a huge potential. There is a huge opportunity to innovate and to benefit from these opportunities.
All right, we'll come back to that. The already existing opportunities which are still untapped to achieve food security on the African continent. Professor, when we talk about food security, Africa always comes on the number first of, if I would say, places or continents or the people that are in danger, if I could say, of having food insecurity. Why? What brings about this?
Well, there are so many factors, and some of them are historically grounded in politics, international markets, but one of them is the entire conception of what is the suitable agricultural system for Africa. So when colonials came to this part of the world, people embarked on those crop commodities for export. Basically, we used to grow what Europeans need.
Right.
And we forgot to grow what we need. For example, my family used to grow coffee, but I've never sipped any cup of coffee during my childhood, and so I don't know for now. For young generation, it might seem like kind of weird, but I've never used coffee at my home, whereas we used to grow it for export.
All right.
So the allocation of resources, the mindset at that period was only geared to export crops for the colonials. Number one, historical disruption. So they disrupted our ecological system, and we embarked on those crops which are not basically what we used to consume. Number two, and that goes with number one, the allocation of resources. The entire concept of agricultural schools and curriculum and programs were designed according to the needs of the colonials. Then came the independence period, where we tried to forge our own, craft our own strategies. Again came the issue of resources. How do we get financial resources if we are to develop our own sustainable crop system. You see what I mean? Those are
All right.
So when you get IMF moving into finance, when you get World Bank giving you loan for rice mills, so they design for us. We have never been able to design for ourselves. Now time has come to revisit all those models and make sure that Africa can be also a source of innovation and look at the adaptability. Because yesterday I attended one of the sessions, and it was very moving to see the former Prime Minister of UK, Tony Blair, stating publicly that while he was in office, one of the biggest frustration he's still living with is to see things not done according to the decision they take in the cabinet.
All right.
So, meaning we might be good at conceiving models, deciding to finance them, even the budget, but lack skills and capabilities to implement those decisions. And even if we implement them, sometimes we fail to organize and manage the continuum. So I can give you so many examples in Africa.
Before we even go to implementing these particular policies that are already in place to revamp the agriculture sector on the African continent, in your own perspective, are we still tied to the old history of, to the old perspective of how agriculture should be carried out and what we really need to get out of it?
So what we need here is what we need to get out of it. If we take all the innovations we need, our colleague, your guest, mentioned a couple of issues related to innovation. Now, if we take agriculture and we take the three main problems we are facing, the climate change, the pandemic and the post-pandemic constraints, and then this new era of wars and which affect because of globalization. By the way, we forgot that when the globalization came to us, we thought it was a very good thing because most of the stuffs and goods and commodities were available because of information, because of low transport costs. Now, whenever there is a conflict, you have this container sea freight jumping and multiplied by 2. So what do? You come back home and say, oh, I forgot to work on my own coat, in my own coat. So I'm still relying on China or Ukraine. Today is Ukraine and Russia. Tomorrow it might be China and Taiwan. So we forgot one of the side effects of globalization is to forget what you can produce yourself and rely on what is available on the market.
All right.
So that is also something you need to think about. But if we come back to Africa, now that we know that it's a problem, agriculture is, the world will be populated with roughly 9 billion people by 2030, 2050. And 1 billion, which is roughly more than 10%, is occupied in agriculture sector. In Africa, it comes to even 40, 50%.
All right.
So what do we do with those 50 or 50% who are still busy in agriculture and are not able to feed themselves? And that's how we come to innovation.
Before I come back to you, Mr. Gabriel, talking about how agriculture is carried out on the African continent, for instance, in Rwanda, more than 70% of the country's population actually feed or get their end meat from the agriculture sector. But despite a large number of our population, not even in Rwanda, but in also other different countries, being so much engaged into agriculture, we can still see that people end up being hungry. Why?
The figures that you mentioned about Rwanda is not unique to Rwanda. It characterizes most of African countries.
Sure.
It is true. The majority of the population in Africa depend on agriculture. I think the question that we need to ask is, what kind of agriculture are they dependent on?
All right.
They produce all the time. They're busy. They're hardworking people, the rural producers. But what do they get out of it? We already talked about low productivity, and a greater part of it is consumed there before it is even marketed, which means they will not get enough income. But also they don't produce marketable surplus to sufficiently feed those segment of the population who depend on purchasing their food. So it's not enough. Not enough has been produced in Africa. I think we have to emphasize this point, because the solution is going to be better production. We have to increase production, the bigger portion of the solution. A second problem is the vulnerability, let me say, high degree of vulnerability of economies and livelihoods in Africa on natural factors and being affected by it. You may have been following the situation in the Horn of Africa at the moment as we speak in Somalia. The millions of people are suffering from drought, which has been there for the last 4 years in a row, and wiping out their livestock, which is a very basic asset. In much of the Sahel, close to 40 million people are affected. So whatever little they produce and whatever little assets they have is wiped out by natural factors. And my brother was talking about climate change. This is one example. So how do we address this issue of high level of vulnerability to climate change? Because these are becoming the new normals. We know they are going to come. They have been there. We cannot wish them away, that they're not going to come. How can we prepare ourselves in terms of building resilience to adapt ourselves? 7%, about 7% of cultivated land in Africa is under irrigation. If you compare it with other regions, it is just not there. Even those 7% are concentrated in some relatively better developed areas. If you irrigate your land, it means you will be able to produce more than once a year. It's like shifting production in factories.
All right.
If you depend on rain, that may or may not come. Number one, you don't produce enough. Number two, you succumb to the vagaries of weather. So I think Africa needs to really emphasize on better production, that it will be the basis for better nutrition and sustainable livelihoods and so on. I think the professor has raised the issue of African policies being influenced by factors outside of Africa. In 2003, the African heads of state and government came together in Maputo, Mozambique, and adopted what is called now CADEP, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, in 2003. This is like 19 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. That was done with an acknowledgement amongst the heads of state that we want to own, we want to demonstrate ownership in terms of policy to support the agenda of agricultural transformation. It should be our priority agenda. Now, 19 years after, in 2022, where are we? What have we done? How much resources have been allocated? Even though the commitment was to allocate at least 10% of their national budget, also to demonstrate ownership of those. So I would raise a fundamental question of whether Africa owns its agricultural transformation agenda and whether we are serious about it. Until we answer this in an affirmative way, then we will not be in a position to talk about increased production, transformation of the value chain, and better nutrition, and so on.
Still on that, in your own perspective, is Africa short of policies to actually grow the agriculture sector, or the implementation of these policies for individual governments, for individual countries to actually realize this, in your own perspective?
This question is being raised at different levels. And in fact, it starts by saying the problem in Africa is not policy, rather it is implementation. I would think it is both. If you have a good policy, implementation becomes easier. Why are we stuck in implementation when we have the right kind of policies? Perhaps the policy on finance, on credit access is wrong. So what policy are we talking about? Policies also evolve. And you don't have just one policy that would serve as a silver bullet to address the issue. So different kinds of policies, they evolve based on lessons learned, based on continuous evaluation of the situation and so on. So we have to improve both in policy making, and the policies needs to be formulated on the basis of evidence.
All right.
You see, for Africa, the challenge is the evidence, the data to inform the policy is not readily available. So when we say Africa has, or many African countries, good policy, what are we talking about? On the one hand, we say there is a shortage of data and policies are not based on evidence, and we say the policies are correct. It is, contradictory. So we should work both on improving our policies based on evidences and data, and we should enhance our implementation capacity to make sure that the right kind of policies are implemented, and we should also enhance mutual accountability for to ensure that whatever we have said we will implement are delivered.
All right. Professor, I will continue from what you just stopped, where you just stopped, of trying to bring together both policies and their implementation to actually see the realization of food security in Africa. Also, what's your take on this?
Well, the paradox with Africa is that on one side you have hungry people, then you have beautiful land where you can grow anything, and then on the other side you have the forthcoming world, the already established African free trade area. So basically people establish policies, which is a good thing, free trade area, but what will we trade? If we can't trade agricultural products, then how do we fix the food security issue between countries as a priority? As he recalled the Maputo Declaration, but there is also the Malabo Declaration. And I'm glad to see Rwanda is scoring a green on Malabo Declaration, but it's the only country. So the rest of Africa, if you go to neighbor, I don't want to name neighbors for bad policies, but take one example. In Rwanda, land now is tradable. You have UPI numbers, you have ownership, you have land titles, you can mortgage them, you can sell, land has become, for it now, the last 10, 15 years, a fungible asset, an asset on which you can capitalize and leverage, you look for finance and create. But you know how many countries in Africa are still lagging behind on that issue of fungible assets? You go to Congo, Brazil, to DRC, to land title is a headache. Now, if land title is a headache, then imagine how investors will come and start growing and exchanging within the African free trade area, which we have signed. So the question is also a disconnection between policies. So there are well-wishers with good policies, but there are very, very small room for implementing local policies which are geared to achieving the African agenda, the African goals. And that comes back to the concept of innovation.
All right.
What do we fail on those innovations which are really known? So once you know how to grow potatoes, once you know how to craft avocados or mangoes, an area in which I'm venturing into, how would we fail to implement them? So the question comes back to implementation.
All right.
So if I go back to school, there are 5 key characteristics for any innovation to succeed.
All right.
First of all, when you promote a new idea or a new product, a new process, we take a close look at what we call relative advantage. Are the people really aware of what is the profit of adopting this new crop or this new technique of conducting their irrigation system or agriculture crop residue treatment? So do they benefit from that? Do we demonstrate enough? So the second, on which we are failing, is demonstrability, triability.
All right.
Some countries, when you navigate across, You see, here it's a very small space, but how many stations of RAB, or how many extensions of our universities can show to the farmers how to do things? How many? So ask the question wherever you go to Africa. You will find a very old institution in Cameroon. You will find Ivory Coast era sponsored by French government. But if you ask the School of Agriculture at the University of Abidjan, how many extension services have you provided to people so that they can go, they can learn from you? That's the concept of triability. Let them try, show. And then the complexity, which goes with the two. Complexity, most of the time we run into complex problems. And we provide complex models which are very hard to implement by farmers.
All right.
So when we talk of climate change, there are so many solutions on the table. So, but some of them are involving too much investment, these big valley dams and drip irrigation and the kind. Why don't we go step by step and try to provide something very easy to use, less complex? Then the innovation, for example, if you want to grow something in summertime, how do we teach farmers how to grow crops in summertime? How do we teach them to collect, you know, the rainfall concept? Most of the countries don't border seas or rivers. Even Rwanda population is 90% out of lakes and river. So how do we provide a rain catchment system which can be used to grow crops in summertime, for example, using their hands, using their small bucket. But you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So and then we run into very complex or so innovation, which are complex, are hard to implement.
All right.
They never fail. They will fail on that.
You're
So
right.
the other stuff, the other
other
factor is the observability. Once you provide a solution to farmers in Africa, if they can't see the result, they won't adopt it.
You're right.
For example, the Horn of Africa. I lived in Mexico. I used to teach in Mexico for 9 or 10 years in one of the technological universities over there. You know, Mexico in the desert has 23 days of rainfall. But we used to capture all the rainfall and use it for the rest of the year.
All right.
Now, if you look at, now we have satellites, we have meteorological data, but do they speak to us in terms of decision and modeling what should be the output for farmers? Any single household in Rwanda has, you have the main house, you have the kitchen, you have the stable for 1 or 2 cows, you have the toilet. If you aggregate all that as a rainfall catchment area, basically you have something like 80 square meters. 80 to 100 square meters. Now, the rainfall, if you look at the meteorological data we have today, in most part of the country, the minimum is 800 milliliters. So, what does it say? It says that those are 800 cubic meters falling on 1 square meter. So, if you multiply by 100, that's 80,000 liters. So, that's 80 cubic meters. So, now, transforming the model and growing tomatoes, for example, for summertime, where the price is 1,500. It doesn't take more than 12 liters to grow 1 tomato tree. And you have 80,000. But nobody works on those models. That's what I call local adaptability. So we are good at mathematics, we are good at modeling, but nobody's good in asking yourself about how to fix a very simple problem. When we design it, you saw this water tank, the black one.
Yes.
They come and put 10,000 liters, and then at the top of the Nile, they open stuff so that the rest of the rain can fall very easily and go to where? To Egypt.
Right.
See, that's our mindset as a scientist. Science explains what you see. The air we breathe, the water we drink.
Right.
You go to the laboratory, you check the parameters. So what you see is malnutrition, stunting, and a lot of resources. But stimulating African mindset, especially those, I'm part of it, so-called scientists, to stimulate, to provoke, to adapt what we know and make sure that it works for our people, that's the next challenge.
All right. Challenges and so many unanswered questions, Mr. Gabriel. But as we can agree with what he was saying, we do have many options on the table. But where do we start from?
We start from food.
Okay.
Okay. Whose agenda is it? Or should it be? Should it be the agenda of only people in the Ministry of Agriculture? The professor is talking about a lot of interrelated issues. He raised whether the Continental Free Trade Area will provide the necessary platform for African countries to benefit from trade in agricultural goods and services. And he seems to be a little bit pessimistic. I tend to agree with him, because if you don't have the roads, how do you trade? How do you move food from one place to the other? I come from Ghana. I live in Ghana. The farmers produce a lot of mangoes. And recently, on the one hand, in Accra, people are complaining about very high price of generally food, including
Mango.
Vegetables and fruits, including mango. Farmers who produce in the hinterland, they are complaining that their mangoes are rotting in the field. It cannot be moved. You see, even within the same country. Forget about trading between, among African countries. Dangote recently launched a fertilizer producing plant, producing urea, a multi-billion dollar fertilizer plant. Where are they selling the fertilizer when Africa is now suffering from shortage of fertilizers because of the war in Ukraine? It is being sold in Latin America and elsewhere, because the infrastructure and other regulations, non-tariff and tariff barriers that inhibit trade within Africa are not making it easier. So the point I was trying to, I can bring the issue of healthy diets and nutritious diets. Whose agenda is it? Is it the Ministry of Health, or is it the Ministry of Agriculture? Food safety is one of them we've been talking about. The cost of producing food. Nowadays we're talking about digitalization, and almost everybody has a mobile phone, and we can use this platform to facilitate knowledge sharing, information exchange, and so on. And yet, when you don't have power supply, reliable, I didn't even talk about the irrigation infrastructure and so on. How is the cost of internet and telecommunication? And what is the impact of that on competitiveness of African production? Remember, in Africa, African products are competing with imported products, food items. And sometimes it's cheaper to buy imported rice or chicken than locally produced. And under this kind of circumstances, farmers will not be in a position to sustainably produce. There is no motivation. Why would they invest? It's about investment. So when you talk about prioritization of agriculture, and that's why I say I want to start from food. How about the consumers? The shift in consumption habits. We're complaining about shortage of wheat. How come many of African countries dependent on wheat? Since when? Isn't it possible to substitute African produced items? The technology, the innovation is there. But we have to work with the consumers and so on. So it involves various sectors. It involves multi-sectoral approaches and different stakeholders. It has huge potential for employment, for growth, and so on. but it requires a different approach than what we see currently in Africa. This is what we are trying to advocate.
And which approach are we supposed to take, Professor?
Well, if I may I ask a question? If I'm a guest, but the debate is how. I remember I used to have that kind of strong debate with people from World Bank. I used to take students, American students, to see the World Bank and lecture on development policies. And one of the critical questions we had with the senior staff at the World Bank is, I'm from Africa, you can see it, okay? Now, how come the World Bank for the last 50 years, that was early in 2000, how come the African World Bank has never financed any research and development institution attached to any specific university? Because they used to fund elementary schools, they used to fund this, but I've never seen, during my age as a student, any fund coming from World Bank. But now they have started the Center of Excellences, and I'm not claiming to be behind that move, but at least they did something 4 or 5 years ago with African Mathematical Institute. They're supporting a set of initiatives now within universities. Now, the question I want to ask to our colleague, to our guest, is that debate at World Food Program.
That's actually where I wanted
what are the views
regarding our solutions and what is at hand right now to solve all the issues that we're talking about right now. But before we come to that, he talked about something that is very crucial, the interconnection between different sectors on the continent, be it health-related, be it trade, be it, any kind of sector to collectively contribute to attaining food security on the continent. Before we actually come to this particular thing that he was talking about, and at FAO, if this is really addressed or if certain measures are being taken, what's your take on it?
On the
working together, different sectors, multi-sectoral collaboration to attain.
This is it's a classic problems in. It's a classic problem in economics or any innovation. What we call the urgent principle problem. So sometimes you promote an innovation, and the guy or the ministry behind it is taking the leadership, too much leadership or ownership of it, so that it doesn't extend to other sectors. You don't get the police involved, you don't get the Ministry of Education involved, you don't have the linkage between Ministry of Agriculture and the higher education institution teaching agriculture, for example, or the linkage between RAB. I'm giving you local examples, but it's valid for the rest of Africa. The linkage between Rwanda Agriculture Board and the universities. How can we make sure that what we teach at universities is really a part of the agenda of RAB for improving agriculture sector?
All right.
And that's what we call in economics the principal urgent problem. So if the main driver of this agriculture is RAB, of course everything will be driven according to RAB. And the connection with the universities is not visible. So then how we produce graduates which are not aware of the policies or are not fine-tuned to cope with the challenges we face in the society. So that multi-stakeholders approach is lacking in most African countries. Not even, I think I would bet even all African countries. When you finance research, for example, what is the stake of the private sector on a new crop, on a new seed? Do they participate in the teaching of that need or that concept? Or do government bring private sector to finance research within universities so that the future graduates will be fine-tuned to the needs of Africa?
All right.
I've never seen this in any African country. And it's probably high time to make sure that whatever we promote as a policies, agenda, we have implementers. And implementers are the youth. So the youth now, there is a very big debate of empowering them, but you empower them from day one at the university, at the school.
All right.
You don't empower them when
they're already at the job market.
The job market. So now there is a high temptation in Africa to empower them after the university. You see what I mean? So multi-stakeholders involvement in solving this food security problem should be the target. And that's the reason why I was raising the question, can FAO World Food Program help us implement that spirit of multi-stakeholders approach so that we solve the the food insecurity problem.
Right
I'm
on
part
that,
of, I used to come to Rome. I'm a member of the Sustainable Forestry Group. So we are 20 free scholars around the world, and I often go to Rome. But I have never, at least for forestry, I have a feeling that it's a matter of concern. But I never go beyond this small group. So I'm asking you from the top, is it a concern that you can move, change African mindset and make sure that people collaborate between, inside university, private sector, and government, and then at the continental level?
Okay. Thank you so much. Of course, I can speak for FAO. And the answer is yes. Of course, when I mentioned about the importance of multi-sectoral approaches, multi-stakeholders engagement, it's not just out of my mind. It's because it is what FAO has been advocating for and supporting implementation in the countries.
All right.
Having said this, by the way, we have a collaboration with RUForum, the Regional University Forum for Capacity Strengthening in Agriculture in Africa. They are based in Uganda, in Kampala. Let me say this, because you have also mentioned the World Bank and other international financial institutions. We can bring in Africa Development Bank and others, whether the programs supported by them are also relevant to the multi-sectoral approaches that we're talking about, or are they picky to some? The answer to this lies in what I would call, again, ownership and leadership. The answer does not lie within FAO or within the World Bank or within the Africa Development Bank. The answer lies within the countries, within the national systems. The World Bank doesn't just allocate money or funds just like that. It is a result of negotiations, priority statements by the government, and so on. These are led by the ministers of finance, and we encourage the ministers of agriculture, with whom we work mostly, to talk to their colleagues, the ministers of finance, to make sure that agriculture, or a portion, the relevant aspect of agriculture to that particular program, support program, is adequately captured. What we observe is that it is not usually the case. The ministers of finance and the offices of the president, as they identify an area, a sector, it could be health, it could be macroeconomic support or whatever, and then they engage the World Bank or Africa Development Bank on the basis of that.
All right.
More active ministers of agriculture who interact on a regular basis with both the Minister of Finance as well as with the Office of the President take advantage of that to make sure that their concerns are captured in that program. If that is the case, the fund is automatic. The fund is, most of it is loan, as you know. It's not free of charge. It's the government who pay, the country that repays. So I want to emphasize, again, we need to strengthen country ownership of the policies and the programs. The World Bank, the FAO, and others are there to support, not to replace the government. So it is a government that should demonstrate ownership, but also provide leadership. This is the issue. I have experiences where...
Before you go on, Mr. Gabriel,
Yes.
What do you mean by ownership? What is it with ownership of agriculture systems in Africa?
Let's use the example mentioned by the professor. Let's say education is being left out. We talk about skills development. We talk about entrepreneurial development. We talk about the young people not interested in agriculture because agriculture is not attractive, and so on. How do we turn the situation around? How do we enhance the capacity of our students? You can't do that without strengthening the capacity of the institution itself, of the universities, including the faculty, the systems, and so on. That requires new way of looking at it, thinking and doing, and resources. Most of the resources are not available from national coffers because there are so many competing things. The government itself depends on external financial resources. So when government reaches out to international financial institutions and technical organizations, if this has been identified as a priority, this is what I mean ownership. The government identifies this as a priority, I want to really change this, then those partners will have no choice, except asking or demanding that, okay, let's make it a business case.
Right.
Let's make it, a good project, because this is a loan, and how this loan is going to help the country in what. So this is what I'm trying to say when I say ownership. Let's not wait or assume that the World Bank or FAO is going to come up with a solution to inform the government that this sector is better. We are going to find it. For FAO, let me be very, very clear how we engage the member countries. We have what we call the country programming framework. It is a framework that will guide our actions, our collaboration with governments for the next 4 or 5 years. And these are set of priorities as identified by the government, and for which FAO, using its comparative advantage, because FAO cannot do anything, everything, we have our own comparative advantage, that we can support the government. So it's based on the government's prioritization that FAO makes available its technical expertise and whatever other resources available, including different platforms. Where we have strong leadership, strong ownership by the government, the results are better. When these are lacking, the projects will be somehow, money will be spent. The reports indicate that the project has been implemented. As soon as the project is finished, that is the end of it. You will see nothing. That will continue.
All right.
There is no sustainability. That's why I keep emphasizing on ownership and leadership as key for bringing about change and transformation.
All right. As we head towards the end, I think if we are to talk about what is not being done right and what should different stakeholders and governments do to actually put this to practice and see the realization of food security in Africa, we could take days and days. But way forward, taking our eyes from right where we are now and see in the future. I'll start with you, Professor. What do we need to prioritize right now? Because at the end of the day, we are not going to keep sitting down and crying and saying we only have this issue, but we are rather going to take necessary steps to see it solved and actually achieve what we want. Where do we need to start? What are the few important steps that need to be taken by governments and different institutions and stakeholders to see the realization of food security in Africa?
Well, when we talk of Africa, there are 54 countries in Africa. So there is no one solution fits all, so one size fits all solution. But some countries are doing very well. Rwanda is doing extremely well, even if we need to improve some small loopholes. Now, the critical issue we face, if we look at if I go through all the conversation we had at Agra, so implementation is one of the mainstream problems, the main problem. Policies exist. Policies can be drafted. Policies can be even copied and pasted and adapted. But as long as you don't have implementers, that poses a very critical challenge for the future of this food security. So that's the one thing, implementation. Then the second thing is using technology to make sure that you cope with the local, but adapted technology, not imported and copy and paste. Adapt technology to each and every context. I gave you the example of a farmer, a poor peasant in Rwanda who would need to raise his income by practicing agriculture in summertime. And he has water, but the only thing we need is to teach him how to harvest that water and use it. So those are critical issues we face, and then making sure that the technology works for us and not against us in very high. Otherwise, there are countries which are doing extremely well on accountability. Ghana is one of them. Rwanda is doing, you see all those doing business. But the rest of Africa, the frustration is we might have some good 5 or 6 good examples, but we need more than that. We need 40 examples.
All right.
Yeah, we need 40 examples because in the end, it doesn't help Rwanda to be the best because troubles might erupt from the bad and affect you in any case. So that's what also we need to, if there is hunger in the Horn of Africa, there's fueling the terrorist saga, fueling the wars and conflict, because they are not doing well. So it's not a question of doing well. Yes, we are doing well. Yes, Mauritius is doing well. Ghana is doing well. All those countries which are often listed as best performers. But it doesn't serve a lot because in the end, it's a continent. It's not even a continent, it's the world.
All right. Mr. Gabriel.
Yes. We are here in Kigali this week for a reason. Last year in September, there was the UN Food System Summit. And of course, as a follow-up to that, countries were working on what's called transformative pathways. So each country was challenged to come up with a kind of game-changing pathways. They have been working on that. So there is no reinventing the wheel. You know, they have been really thinking about it. It's a question of implementation, of course. And there is a lot of opportunities for mutual experience sharing.
Okay.
Just a few minutes ago, a summit was going on. Some of the heads of state from Zimbabwe, from Tanzania, from, of course, from the host country, Rwanda, and from Niger. They were participating in a panel discussion. They were sharing their experiences. I was so happy to hear that. You know, some of them, they're really dealing with some of the strategic issues, learning from this Ukraine crisis. You know, Zimbabwe was talking about, you know, having not just enough wheat in stock, but surplus and ready to sell it. This is news, great news. You know, we focus more on Africa dependent on, you know, Ukraine and so on. We don't speak about these positive things, and it is just next door. We can learn a lot from Tanzania. Vice President was talking about putting in place a fertilizer factory, you know, for them to have this productive capacity so that they don't have to suffer the consequences of dependence on the rest of the world, and which we have seen it already. So a lot of things are happening in Africa already. There are gaps, there are opportunities for experience sharing, lessons learning of best practices. Organizations such as mine, the FAO, one of the good things we do is facilitate that kind of experience sharing and lessons learning using our extensive global network, but also body of knowledge, and provide the platform for that. And this is how innovation also can take roots. Innovation is not something that you bring it from somewhere and then apply, just, you know, graft it. It evolves naturally. And that is where it stays. When it is, we're also talking about institutional innovation, innovation in finance, innovation in many things. So it's about the mindset. It's about how we think about ourselves and taking responsibility for our future as well, and to engage in a mutually beneficial cooperation and collaboration.
All right. My last question to both of you. Goals have been set. I'm not against visions, get me clearly, but looking at what is being done on the ground, it's really hard to achieve this. That is my own opinion. But I'll ask you both, starting with you, Professor. Attaining zero hunger by 2030, is this goal just a dream, or it's achievable if we do what is right to achieve it?
It's achievable, because apart from the shocks, there's one thing we didn't discuss, and it's unfortunate we didn't touch it. in terms of shocks or disasters, countries should put in place what we call in strategy a early warning signal system. So the early warning signal system in strategy is based on the fact of predicting crisis, shocks, and getting prepared for that. So in most African countries, people don't have that speed. We get some of the countries, most of the countries have, for example, for oil, some of them have 6 months reserve, but ask all those African countries who has a 12 months grain storage. No, and the early warning signal system is based on prediction. Again, it's based on technology, on data. We have enough data now to predict what will be the season and the harvest. But we never go back to the root and make sure that what we have in the oil, we have the same. I mean, I'm talking of other countries. Rwanda has done some improvement on that. We have Ibigega, we have this. Our ancestors, they used to build the concept of, I don't know what you call it in Ghana or in Ethiopia, the Kijega. The Kijega concept was based on hard times. So that food storage, how it was built. But now, if you look at most of the food we consume, there is no storage for 5 or 6 months. So the early warning signal system in strategy is based on the predictability of shocks and disasters, based on historical data and prediction of future outcome, of future output.
So it's attainable?
It's attainable.
All right.
Attainable on the condition that you implement those innovations which failed, achievable on the condition that you put in place that early warning signal system so that if there is a COVID shock, there is measures to cope with it.
All right.
Which is not the case. So the COVID shows us that nobody was prepared to cope with it.
All right. Mr. Adebe Dasley, are you optimistic about the future?
The zero hunger goal was not set out of a wishful thinking. It's not a theoretical consideration either. It was based on experiences. Brazil, remember, during the former president, what was his name? Lula. They set a 10 years period to achieve zero hunger. They achieved it. And in fact, the Malabo Declaration of achieving zero hunger by 2025, which was set in 2014, was taking that time perspective into consideration. It's not just Brazil. Other countries have done it, China and others. So given the potential, the huge potential that Africa has, why can't we achieve it? It's possible to achieve it. It's achievable. But we have to work. We have to implement. Otherwise, we continue to shift the goals, which is not going to be the solution.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Adebe Haile Gabriel, the Assistant Director General of FAO and a representative for Africa, for being with us on the show tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jide Karuranga, researcher and analyst, for being with us on the show tonight.
Thank you.
All right. And I will just end from an important statement that President Paul Kagame said today with the ongoing AGRF meeting. Africa should not be struggling with food insecurity given our natural endowments. We can feed ourselves and even feed others, but as they just said, it's attainable, but we need to do what is necessary and take the right steps to achieve food security on the African continent. And here we end our program tonight, 360 degrees up. Until next time, stay safe and have a great evening. Goodbye.